The night before, as they walked back from the dock, with the last of the light slipping over the water, Malik had asked the question before anyone else could. "Granddad," he said, "can we stay another day?" Elias had glanced at him, then at the others. Zuri was already leaning sleepily against his side. Naya tried to look indifferent and failed. Io said nothing, but his face gave him away. Even that small silence carried hope. Elias smiled. "I think," he said, "that can be arranged." So they stayed, in a small cabin not far from the lake, with screen doors that sighed when they opened, and a porch that looked out over the dark water. The night settled around them gently. Morning came slowly, and by the following afternoon they were back on the dock again, lines in the water, the lake stretching wide and calm beneath the lowering sun. The fish had long since been unhooked and released. The sun was lower now, turning the lake into shifting bronze, and the dock held the quiet weight of an afternoon that had given more than anyone expected from it. Zori had stopped looking at her rod every few seconds and was now leaning against Elias's side, as if catching one fish had settled something in her. Malik was still checking his line too often. Nia had begun pretending she was not listening quite as closely as she actually was. Io sat nearest the edge, still and watchful, eyes on the water, but attention somewhere deeper. Elias adjusted the reel in his hand and let the silence stretch a moment longer. "So," Malik said at last, "did they say yes?" Elias smiled faintly. "No," he said. "Not that night." Naya frowned. "Then what was all that for?" "For seriousness," Elias replied. "Agreement reached too quickly usually belongs more to emotion than conviction." Io glanced at him. "So he let it sit?" "Yes," Elias said. And then he watched what survived the silence. The night after the garden, none of them slept particularly well. Not because they were frightened in any simple way, because each of them had been handed something too large to set down neatly. Malcolm returned to his room and left the page on his desk instead of inside a book where it might have looked accidental. He changed his clothes, sat on the edge of the bed, stood again, crossed back to the desk, and read the page a second time as if the words might have altered in the last 10 minutes. Objective: build the conditions for African unity. Method: prepare quietly. Build skill. Build trust. Build reach. Timeline: 5 to 10 years. Principle: live visibly. Work deliberately. Return ready. He laughed once under his breath, not because anything was funny, but because disbelief sometimes arrived dressed as amusement. "Madness," he murmured. Then, after a pause, "serious madness." He did not throw the page away. Across campus, Chadwick placed his copy in a drawer, shut it, then opened the drawer again almost immediately and took the page back out. He disliked the document on principle. It was too clean, too condensed, too vulnerable to interpretation. Ambitious language without implementation detail irritated him. Vision statements irritated him. People who said history could be moved by will alone irritated him even more. And yet he stood by the narrow window in his room and read it again, more slowly this time, not because he believed it, because he was trying to locate its failure points. 5 to 10 years. Too long if discipline failed. Too short if infrastructure lagged. Too visible if anyone became idealistic in public. Too fragile if trust was assumed instead of built. By the time he set the page down, he had already begun the first thing he always did with anything dangerous enough to matter. He was stress testing it. Maya returned to her room, took out a notebook, and wrote only one sentence at the top of the page. What would this require to function without collapsing? Then she sat very still, Unity was a beautiful word in speeches. That was precisely why she distrusted it, because beautiful words invited lazy thinking. What did unity require? Movement across borders, supply lines, trusted chains of contact, material resilience, financial discretion, multiple redundancies, people capable of carrying instructions without needing every layer explained to them. The question expanded as she wrote. Soon the page was no longer philosophical at all. It was structural. Ashanti took her copy back to her dorm and laid it beside two books already open on her desk. One dealt with post-colonial legal theory, the other with archives, displaced by war and empire. She looked at the page Kwame had handed her, then at the books, then back again. Build the conditions, not seize power, not announce revolution, not declare a movement into existence before its bones had formed. Build the conditions. That was different, more patient, more dangerous, and to her mind, more historically serious than anything naive enough to mistake declaration for transformation. She thought about failed federations, about anti colonial coalitions broken by pressure, ego, sabotage, exhaustion, and the inherited violence of borders drawn by people who never intended coherence to survive them. She thought about the archive, not merely as storage, but as proof of continuity, about the kinds of futures denied legitimacy because those who desired them could not produce an acceptable lineage for them when challenged. She folded the page once and placed it inside a book on constitutional formations, not hidden, kept. Kwame, meanwhile, did exactly what the others found most disturbing: nothing. He did not pursue them the next morning, did not engineer a collision after class, did not send a note, did not perform patience in a way meant to be noticed. He attended lectures, answered when spoken to, listened more than he offered, and allowed the proposition to remain where he had placed it, with them. By the end of the week, that restraint had begun to work on all four of them differently. Malcolm noticed first in the second class. He shared with Chadwick. Kwame was there, seated two rows ahead, taking notes as though the most consequential conversation any of them had had all semester had not taken place behind the humanities building days earlier. It annoyed Malcolm on principle. After class, he caught Chadwick outside. So we're all just pretending that didn't happen, he asked. Chadwick adjusted the strap of his bag. Pretending what didn't happen? The garden, the paper, the small proposal to quietly reorganize the future of a continent. Chadwick looked at him without expression. That, he said, narrows it down. Malcolm stared. You're impossible. No, Chadwick said. I'm unconvinced. But you kept the paper. That earned Malcolm exactly the look he had been aiming for. Did you? Chadwick asked. Malcolm smiled. Obviously. 2 days later, Maya found Ashanti alone after seminar and stood beside her in the corridor while students passed around them in overlapping noise. You're thinking about it, Maya said. Ashanti did not bother pretending otherwise. Yes. Do you think he's serious? Ashanti turned her head. Yes. That's not what I asked. I know. Maya waited. Ashanti slid a book into her bag. I think seriousness is the least complicated part of him. That answer stayed with Maya longer than she expected. By the start of the second week, the silence itself had become a conversation none of them were willing to name. It was Malcolm who broke it. He did so in the most Malcolm way possible. Kwame had just stepped out of class when Malcolm fell into step beside him. You know, Malcolm said lightly, most people, after inviting four near strangers to imagine continental realignment over a 10-year timeline, would follow up. Kwame kept walking. Would they? Yes. Perhaps that is why most people shouldn't do it. Malcolm laughed once, unwillingly. There it is, he said. That exact thing. That is why we need to meet again. Kwame glanced at him. We? Yes, we. As in the people you unsettled on purpose, and then abandoned to their own thoughts. I did not abandon anyone. No. You simply disappeared in plain sight, which is somehow more irritating. Kwame's mouth shifted the slightest fraction. Malcolm took that as a victory. Tomorrow evening, he said. Same garden, and this time you do not get to hand us a page and vanish into philosophy. Kwame said nothing for a moment. Then, very well. When Malcolm informed the others, none of them acted surprised enough to be convincing. The second meeting felt different before anyone spoke. The garden was the same. Stone path, old walls, the hedge muting the wider campus into distance, but the arrangement of their bodies carried less uncertainty now. Maya arrived first this time. Ashanti came not long after. Kwame was already there when Malcolm entered, and Chadwick, to his visible irritation, was the last once again. Naturally, Malcolm murmured, seeing him. Chadwick ignored him. Maya began. Define unity, she said. Kwame looked at her. In what frame? In the one where you asked 4 people to build conditions for it. That almost made Malcolm smile. Kwame folded his hands behind his back. Not sameness, he said. Not forced erasure of state, language, difference, or local sovereignty. Coherence where fragmentation is currently exploited. Alignment where division is currently purchased. Capacity where dependency is currently manufactured. Chadwick spoke next. That is language, he said, not design. Yes, Kwame said, because design without language usually fails in silence, and language without design usually dies in applause. We need both. Ashanti watched him carefully. And legitimacy? Kwame turned to her. Essential. How do you establish it? She asked. Not emotionally, historically, politically, legally. Because if a structure appears without lineage, power calls it illegitimate before it ever has the chance to prove itself. Then lineage must be recovered, Kwame said. Recovered from where? From every place it has been scattered, he replied. History, law, memory, oral record, institutional failure, previous attempts. Every fragment that proves this vision is not fantasy merely because it has been interrupted. Ashanti did not answer right away. That, for her, was a form of answer. Maya stepped in again. Even if legitimacy exists, none of this functions without execution. Kwame nodded. Agreed. What are we actually building toward? She asked. Because conditions can mean almost anything. Diplomatic networks, economic coordination, movement infrastructure, secure communications, supply chains, cultural consensus, counter-surveillance, financial shielding. You are asking for years of preparation. Preparation for what, precisely? Kwame let the question settle. For the moment, he said, when restoration stops being symbolic and becomes structural. That quieted them. Malcolm leaned forward slightly. Explain. Kwame looked at him. The world will tolerate moral language longer than it will tolerate material change. Objects can return. Apologies can be negotiated. Commissions can be formed. All of that can be absorbed. His gaze moved across all 4 of them. But when restoration begins altering control, resources, infrastructure, influence, legitimacy, mobility, narrative authority, that is when resistance hardens. If that moment comes before there is enough capacity behind it, the effort dies. Maya's expression sharpened. So did Chadwick's. Now at last they were discussing the same thing: preparation. What you're saying, Chadwick said slowly, is that this would need to be layered. Yes. Distributed. Yes. Compartmentalized. Yes. Resilient to observation. Yes. Only then did Chadwick give the smallest nod. It was not agreement, but it was no longer dismissal. Malcolm broke the tension. Well, he said, that's unfortunate. Maya glanced at him. For who? For all of us. Because this is beginning to sound organized. That earned the briefest laugh of the evening. It mattered more than anyone acknowledged. By the time they left the garden that night, nothing had been finalized. But something had changed. The vision no longer belonged solely to Kwame's private inheritance. It had met resistance, survived questioning, and begun acquiring shape from other minds. After that, their meetings became easier to hide because they looked so ordinary. A bench outside the library with too many books between them. A seminar room used after hours because Maya had secured access under the pretext of a student research group. A corner table in a cafe where Malcolm's laughter kept the atmosphere from appearing severe. A late night classroom where Chadwick drew diagrams no one else could fully read yet. From the outside, they were students, studying, arguing, building whatever young ambitious people build when they still believe time belongs to them. From the inside, the work deepened. Kwame held the long map, never every detail, never enough to suffocate others with his own framing, but enough to keep the discussion from shrinking into disconnected excellence. He understood now that if the vision was to survive, it could not remain his proposition alone. It needed to become a structure in which each of them could recognize not merely a role, but necessity. Malcolm kept widening their language, not just literal language, though he moved between them with that ease too, answering a point in French, testing a concept in Arabic, returning to English with a shift in tone that made even disagreement feel more navigable. He kept asking how the future would speak to itself, if it ever wanted to be believed. Who would persuade? Who would negotiate? How would alignment be communicated across political cultures, classes, and historical wounds without flattening their differences into slogans? People keep talking as if coordination is only technical, he said one evening, leaning back in a chair while the others circled a draft framework Maya had sketched out. It isn't. Half of coordination is interpretive. People need to understand not only what is being asked of them, but what it means that they are being asked. Meaning doesn't move cargo, Chadwick said. No, Malcolm replied, but it does determine whether the people controlling the roadblocks decide to let it pass. That stayed on the board. Chadwick began with suspicion and turned it into architecture. He questioned everything first because he trusted nothing impressive that had not already been broken in his mind and rebuilt stronger. If Maya spoke of movement, he asked what happened when routes failed. If Malcolm spoke of negotiation, he asked how consent would be verified. If Ashanti spoke of continuity, he asked how records would be protected from seizure, distortion, or romantic misuse. If Kwame outlined layered networks, Chadwick wanted to know where the breach would occur first. Assume exposure, he said once, erasing half a page of notes with unnecessary force. Not because exposure is inevitable, but because systems built only for ideal conditions deserve to fail. Maya nodded before anyone else did. That part, she said, I agree with. Ashanti began collecting not simply references, but lineage, not nostalgia, not sentiment, usable continuity. She mapped previous federative attempts, legal proposals, continental frameworks. treaties, abandoned negotiations, erased or half remembered models of coordination. She gathered speeches no one cited properly anymore, and policy drafts that had died in committees before they could become institutions. She tracked how unity had been discussed, desired, undermined, trivialized, and deferred. This cannot sound invented when challenged, she said, not because invention is bad, because power discredits what it can isolate from history. So we root it, Kwame said. We evidence it, Ashanti corrected. Maya made the entire thing less romantic and therefore more real. She turned conversations into sequences. She knew visions died from vagueness more often than opposition. When Malcolm spoke of diplomatic corridors, she asked who maintained them. When Chadwick designed a secure layer, she asked who could still operate if one node vanished. When Ashanti traced legitimacy, Maya wanted to know when and how legitimacy would have to become actionable in real time. On one long night in an empty study room, she drew four words in the center of a page: move, hold, retrieve, continue. The others stared. What is that? Malcolm asked. The minimum condition for anything to survive pressure, Maya said. You have to be able to move what matters. Hold it where it can't be easily compromised. Retrieve what gets scattered. Continue when conditions change. Chadwick looked at the page, then nodded once. That, he said, is useful. By the end of their final year, no one would have called what they were doing a plan in public. Privately, however, the word no longer felt exaggerated. It remained incomplete, still too dependent on future competence, still too vulnerable to life moving in directions none of them could yet fully predict. But its categories existed now, its pressures, its requirements, its probable enemies, its needed disciplines. And that was when Chadwick introduced the first layer no one else had thought to demand yet. It happened in a seminar room they had borrowed under an unremarkable pretext near the end of term, the campus around them already drifting toward departure. Boxes appeared in dorm hallways. Final papers were spoken of with varying degrees of honesty. The ordinary machinery of leaving had begun. Chadwick arrived with five small devices in a plain, dark case. Malcolm looked at them first. Should I be concerned? Yes, Chadwick said. That is not reassuring. It isn't meant to be. He set the case on the table and opened it. Inside lay what looked at first glance like stripped down phones. No branding, no decorative casing, no obvious interface beyond a dark, inactive screen. Maya frowned. What are those? A beginning, Chadwick said. Ashanti picked one up carefully. Of? Private continuity. That phrase held the room. Chadwick leaned against the table, arms folded. If this remains only memory, it dies with distance, he said. People move. Careers begin. Borders intervene. Phones get replaced. Accounts get monitored. Platforms change their terms, their security, their ownership, their loyalties. Public infrastructure is convenient precisely because it isn't ours. He nodded toward the devices. These don't connect through anything obvious. No standard account registration, no persistent contact list, no location services, no conventional cloud, no ordinary backup. They recognize only each other, and even that recognition is layered. Malcolm turned one over in his hand. You built these? I built enough, Chadwick said. The rest I stripped away. For what? Maya asked. For communication that does not advertise itself as communication. Kwame, who had said nothing yet, looked at him with something close to approval. Explain the layers. Chadwick did. Not theatrically, not to impress. as if briefing people who did not need to admire the work to understand its function. One layer for simple signaling, one for direct exchange, one for segmented documents. No single device carried more than necessary at rest. Shared material could be divided. Certain phrases triggered route changes. Inactivity over specific intervals altered access structure. Nothing about it was foolproof, which Chadwick said twice with visible irritation before anyone could imagine otherwise. But it reduced visibility, reduced dependency, reduced the number of external systems through which their continuity could be exposed, mapped, or casually inherited by companies and states whose interests were never neutral. So, Malcolm said slowly, you made us secret phones. No, Chadwick replied. I made us a private layer, which sounds better but is still in essence secret phones. They are not for social use. I assumed that from your complete absence of charm in the packaging. That brought the room briefly back to ease. Then Maya asked the real question. Why now? Chadwick looked at her. Because after this term, ordinary proximity ends, he said. And if this matters, distance has to stop meaning dilution. No one answered immediately, because the force of what he had done was not merely technical, it was declarative. He had built for their future as if it already existed. Kwame reached out and took one of the devices. Good, he said. From Chadwick, that might have earned a smile. From Kwame, it meant more. They graduated, not together in the neat way sentimental stories prefer, but near enough to feel the threshold. Robes, heat, families, cameras, language about promise, the public ritual of people being congratulated for a future no one in the crowd could actually see. They embraced. Stay reachable, Maya said. Through the private layer, Chadwick replied. Malcolm shook his head. That cannot be the permanent name. It is descriptive. It is joyless. Ashanti adjusted the strap on her bag. That also describes Chadwick. Even he nearly smiled. Then the years began doing what years always do. They separated people outwardly while clarifying them underneath. Year 2. The first regrouping took place in Accra, not for symbolism alone, though symbolism mattered. The city had rhythm, movement, political memory, and enough layered life to conceal seriousness inside ordinary motion. Malcolm arrived from an international fellowship, already more polished in rooms of power than he had been in university, though he wore the growth lightly. He had spent 2 years moving through institutions that presented themselves as neutral while training people to recognize the difference between language and position only after it was too late. He understood committee phrasing now, development vocabulary, the soft violence of policy that sounded collaborative while fixing outcomes in advance. Chadwick came in quieter, sharper, carrying less and seeing more. He had moved through technical environments that rewarded brilliance, provided it stayed useful to the structures already in place. He had learned quickly where innovation was welcome, where it was contained, and how often security language functioned as a mask for power retention. Maya arrived with 2 bags and no wasted motion. Logistics had become less abstract to her by force. Systems failed in reality differently than they failed on paper, and she had spent 2 years learning where movement broke: customs delays, procurement corruption, fragile coordination, last mile improvisation mistaken for strategy. Ashanti carried folders and memory with equal seriousness. Graduate work had sharpened her, but not into detachment. She had gone deeper into legal frameworks, archival recovery, and the politics of legitimacy. mapping not just what had been lost, but how people in power learned to dismiss recovery as sentiment whenever it threatened jurisdiction. Kwame had called the meeting only once, through the private layer, no excess language. Accra, 3 days, come prepared to revise scope. They met in a rented flat above a street where music drifted up at night and vendors called through the heat of the afternoon. The room held a table too small for the papers Maya spread across it and a fan that made more noise than relief. The meeting was not warm at first. Too much time had passed. Too much had changed. People who had once been students together were now adults, bringing real experience back to a proposition that could no longer survive on youthful intelligence alone. That was precisely why it worked. Malcolm began by dismantling their earlier assumptions about international receptivity. We were naive about consensus, he said plainly, not because consensus is impossible, because institutions cooperate publicly only when the underlying incentives can bear it. The moment incentive and moral language separate, moral language becomes theater. Maya nodded. So the path cannot depend on public agreement. No, Malcolm said. It can use it. It cannot depend on it. Ashanti added, which means legitimacy has to exist before recognition does. Chadwick, already sketching a revised security structure, said, and the communication chain needs to assume hostile interest long before open resistance. Kwame listened, then, at the right moment, narrowed the room. So, he said, what must change? By the end of Accra, the first version of their early framework was gone, not abandoned, refined. Some ambitions were reordered, some timelines lengthened. Some categories split into substructures. Their language sharpened too. They spoke less about unity as destination and more about coordinated capacity as precondition. When they left, Malcolm lingered by the window and looked down at the street below. It's stranger now, he said. What is? Maya asked. That I believe it more after making it harder. Kwame looked at him. Good. Year 5. By the second major regrouping held in Nairobi, they no longer needed to convince one another that the work was real. Now the question was whether reality was maturing fast enough. Technology had shifted. So had capital flows, surveillance patterns, geopolitical attention, and the language of development. New opportunities opened because the world kept mistaking connectivity for neutrality. New dangers emerged because dependency had grown more complex, not less. Chadwick arrived with an evolved private layer that no longer resembled the stripped down devices he had first handed them years earlier. The principle remained the same: no unnecessary exposure, no sentimental trust in convenience, no assumption that public systems would remain benign simply because they were widely used. He had built modularity now, segmentation, layers that could survive partial compromise without revealing full structure. He explained only what the others needed to know. Malcolm, watching him work through the briefing, shook his head. You are deeply worrying. I'm realistic, Chadwick said. That is not the comforting distinction you think it is. Maya spread out route maps and infrastructure notes. Some were official, some were not. She had begun to see how corridors formed not merely from roads and ports, but from predictability, trust, and the right people deciding not to interfere at the wrong moment. We keep discussing movement as if it begins when we need it, she said. It doesn't. Movement begins years earlier in what people are used to seeing. Ashanti had brought legal documents, policy drafts, and historical models of confederation, federation, customs union, and regional governance. She was tracing what forms of alignment could be recognized, resisted, or strategically misunderstood, depending on how they were introduced. We keep thinking in political categories too late in the sequence, she said. Culture, record, and narrative prepare what law later claims to formalize. If narrative ground is absent, law arrives exposed. Malcolm added another layer. External actors will tolerate self determination in language long before they tolerate it in infrastructure. And in resources, Kwame said. That word sat heavily between them. Resources. Because by then they all understood that no meaningful rebalancing could remain purely symbolic forever. Material questions would come, control questions, extraction questions, questions that turned admiration into opposition the moment someone realized loss might be measurable. They worked until dawn on the final night in Nairobi. At sunrise, Chadwick closed his laptop, looked around the table, and said the thing none of them had yet voiced aloud. We are past theory. No one corrected him. Year 7. The regrouping in Dakar was shorter and more severe, not because trust had weakened, because competence had grown. The need for explanation was shrinking. They met under tighter conditions now. Arrivals separated, departures staggered, documentation minimized, not from paranoia for its own sake, but because by year 7, each of them knew enough about the world to understand how often patterns are detected by people who do not yet understand what they are seeing. Malcolm had become harder to read in the best possible way. He could move through official and unofficial rooms without advertising which kind he preferred. He understood the vanity of states, the insecurity of powerful institutions, the transactional language of cooperation, and the value of saying less until the right person had mistaken your silence for agreement. Maya had become formidable. No other word served. She could read failure before it happened, because she had spent years living near systems that broke under pressure and then watching others misdiagnose the collapse. Her work no longer sounded like planning. It sounded like conditions. Ashanti had become dangerous in a quieter register. She now carried not just archives, but frames, ways of making continuity legible to people trained to dismiss it until it became inconvenient to do so. She could move from history to legal structure to moral necessity without losing precision. Chadwick had become exactly what his younger self had promised to become, without ever boasting about it. A builder of hidden resilience, not invulnerable systems. He distrusted that kind of language too much, but systems difficult to map fully, difficult to collapse entirely, difficult to interpret correctly from the outside. Kwame watched them around the table and understood something that made him quieter and prouder. The plan no longer needed his belief to remain alive. That was success. In Dakar, their discussions turned openly toward timing, not action yet, sequencing, thresholds. What signs would indicate readiness? What developments in infrastructure, technology, cultural discourse, institutional weakness, and regional coordination would need to converge before a first decisive movement could occur without burning the larger possibility too early? At one point, Malcolm looked at the notes between them and said almost lightly, "Do you realize we sound like people planning a future none of our professors would have believed we were serious enough to deserve?" Ashanti didn't look up from the document she was annotating. "We were serious," she said. "No," Chadwick replied. "We were intelligent. This is worse." That was the only joke anyone made for an hour. Year 9. By the time they met again in Addis Ababa, the distance between intention and practice had narrowed enough to make the room feel charged even in stillness. No one arrived carrying ideas anymore. They arrived carrying active components. Malcolm brought channels, relationships that were not friendships, not exactly, but something more useful. Access without visibility, dialogue without declaration, the ability to hear how institutions described pressure before they admitted it publicly. Maya brought pathways, routes, redundancies, movement logic, timing matrices, practical conditions under which objects, information, people, and later influence could shift without announcing the full architecture supporting the shift. Ashanti brought grounds, documented continuity, legal frameworks, narrative strategies, and the careful shaping of legitimacy, so that when restoration moved beyond theory, it would not appear as rupture without ancestry. Chadwick brought the invisible spine, secure layers, adaptive channels, distributed structures built not for spectacle, but for survival. Kwame brought convergence. He had spent years watching the map change underneath the world's own explanations of itself. Some things had become easier than even he had predicted, others harder. But the essential truth remained. Restoration would be tolerated only up to the point where it altered control. After that, response would sharpen, which meant the first moves would matter enormously. Not only what was done, what was chosen, what was signaled, what was returned, what remained unnamed. At the Addis meeting, they argued longer than they had in years, not destructively, precisely, because precision mattered more now than enthusiasm ever had. How many? Maya asked. Not enough to look random, Malcolm said. Not enough to expose total reach. Symbolic first, Ashanti said. But not only symbolic, objects with memory weight and institutional visibility. Distributed, Chadwick added. No pattern easy enough to model after 3 incidents. Kwame listened, then made the final adjustment. Africa first, he said. No one questioned it. Not because any of them needed convincing anymore, because they all understood the moral and structural truth at the center of the operation. If restoration did not begin there, the sequence would lose its meaning. They worked until the notes between them became no longer notes, a framework, then a sequence, then finally the first operational shape of what the world would one day mistake for impossibility until it was already underway. When the meeting ended, no one rose immediately. The room held that rare silence created not by uncertainty, but by recognition. They had reached the edge, not of the mission, of preparation. Malcolm exhaled first. So, he said quietly, this is real. Maya looked at him. It's been real. You know what I mean? Yes, she said. I do. Ashanti closed the final folder in front of her with deliberate care. No theatrics, no visible emotion. But the gesture carried its own force. Chadwick shut down the system he had been using and looked around the table, eyes resting on each of them in turn. If we do this badly, he said, we teach them where to look. Kwame nodded. Then we do it well. No one smiled at that. There was nothing to soften. The final year wasn't spent in anticipation. It was spent in work, verification, testing, adjustment, silence where silence was needed, movement where movement had to become ordinary before it could become meaningful. Then came the first night. Not in London, not yet. Elsewhere first, in smaller calibrations, no headline would understand, even if it saw them clearly. A proofing of channels, a rehearsal of timing, a discipline of sequence. And then the larger movement began assembling itself. Not out of nowhere, out of 10 years. Back on the dock, Malik had gone completely still. So by the time the first thing happened, he said slowly. They already knew what they were doing. Yes, Elias said. Nia looked out over the darkening water, and everybody else thought it had just started. Yes, Io understood before the others did. His voice was quiet. That's why it looked impossible. Elias turned the reel once more and looked at him. Yes, he said, because the world usually only sees the moment something becomes visible. It mistakes visibility for beginning. Zuri tilted her head. But it began way before. Long before, Elias said. The wind moved cooler across the lake now. Somewhere farther down the dock, another family was laughing over something ordinary. The sky had deepened into evening. The shoreline lights were beginning to come on one by one. Malik frowned. So then, episode one, Elias looked at him. Yes, he said. Now you understand what you were really looking at. No one spoke for a moment after that. The children were no longer hearing the story the same way they had before. That was always part of it. A story changes once you know where its foundation is buried. Io broke the silence. So what happened when they finally moved? Elias's expression did not change, but something in it sharpened. When they finally moved, he said, the world called it theft because the world had not yet learned the difference between taking and returning. He reeled in the line, stood, looked out across the dark water one last time. And by then, he said, it was already too late to stop the first sequence. That landed, exactly as it needed to. Elias gathered the tackle box. Nia folded the extra cloth without being asked. Malik nearly forgot his rod in his distraction. Zuri took Elias's free hand automatically. Io walked beside them all in silence, his mind clearly several steps ahead. Behind them, the dock settled back into evening. Ahead of them, the path to the car was dim but clear, and somewhere far beyond the lake, beyond the story as the children had first understood it, the opening moves of a 10-year design were already waiting to be seen for what they had always been. Not improvisation, preparation, not chaos, sequence, not the beginning. The return of a plan matured in silence